Isaac Newton invented calculus, discovered gravity, and dismantled our entire understanding of light, all before he turned 26 years old. And then, when a German mathematician named Gottfried Leibniz independently invented calculus a few years later, Newton spent the final 30 years of his life trying to annihilate him. Not debate him, not challenge him, annihilate him. Newton used his position as the most powerful scientist in England to rig a royal investigation, write his own anonymous verdict, and hound Leibniz so relentlessly that the man died alone, attended only by his secretary, while the rest of Europe had quietly moved on. The greatest mind in human history was also, by almost any measure, the most socially catastrophic person who ever lived. And what is terrifying is that one of those things may have directly caused the other. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is deeply weird. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day, 1642, in Woolsthorpe, Lincolnshire, England. He was premature, so premature that the midwives reportedly said he could fit inside a quart pot and doubted he would survive the night. His father, also named Isaac Newton, had died 3 months before his birth. So from the very first moment of his life, Newton arrived into absence. No father, a mother who was grieving, a body so small it seemed like a mistake. He survived, obviously, but things did not exactly improve. When Newton was 3 years old, his mother Hannah remarried. Her new husband was a wealthy clergyman named Barnabas Smith, and Barnabas made one thing very clear. He did not want a stepchild. So Hannah moved into the rectory with her new husband and left 3-year-old Isaac with his maternal grandmother. She lived less than a mile away. Newton could presumably see the house where his mother now lived with another man's children. He stayed with his grandmother for 9 years. I want you to sit with that for a second. 9 years. The entirety of his childhood. His mother, alive, nearby, unreachable. Newton later wrote in a notebook a list of sins he had committed. Most of them were ordinary enough. Missing church, idle thoughts on Sundays. But buried in the list, written in the same calm, methodical handwriting he used for everything, was this: threatening to burn my father and mother Smith and the house over them. He was a child, writing down the things he believed God would judge him for. And one of those things was a fantasy of burning his mother's house down with her inside it. This is not a metaphor. This is not poetic. This is a small, lonely boy in 1646 writing down his darkest thoughts in a ledger like a spiritual accounting exercise, and then apparently moving on because Newton did not process emotions. He archived them. He went to Cambridge at 18. He was listed as a subsizar, meaning he was poor enough that he had to wait on wealthier students in exchange for reduced fees. The future president of the Royal Society, the man who would later be called the greatest scientist who ever lived, was cleaning the rooms of richer boys and running their errands for pocket money. He had almost no friends at Cambridge. He had no romantic relationships. He kept detailed journals of his thoughts and experiments, and the journals are startling not because of what they contain, but because of what they do not. Almost no other people appear in them. Newton existed at Cambridge as a kind of solitary engine. And then in 1665, the bubonic plague hit England. Cambridge sent everyone home. Newton went back to Woolsthorpe, to the farmhouse where he had grown up, and he stayed there for roughly 18 months. He was 22 years old. He had no colleagues, no laboratory, no professors, no seminars. He had paper, ink, a prism he had bought at a local fair, and a mind that apparently operated at a frequency the rest of the universe could not tune into. In those 18 months, he invented calculus. He developed his theory of universal gravitation. He discovered that white light was not pure, but composed of every color in the spectrum. He did this quietly, alone, in a farmhouse in Lincolnshire, and then he did not tell anyone. He wrote it all down in private notebooks and essentially sat on it for years. In some cases, for decades. This is the part that I keep coming back to. Newton did not just make these discoveries. He hoarded them. He was ferociously protective of his ideas, not because he wanted to publish them and claim credit, but almost the opposite, because he did not want to engage with the world at all. Publishing meant correspondence. Correspondence meant critics. Critics meant people disagreeing with him, and Newton found disagreement not just frustrating, but personally threatening in a way that is genuinely difficult to exaggerate. I will show you exactly how bad it got in a few minutes. But first, I need you to understand the scale of what Newton was hiding, because it makes what comes later even more extraordinary and even more inexcusable. Calculus, in case you have spent the last few decades successfully avoiding it, is the mathematics of change. It allows you to describe how things move, how they accelerate, how areas and volumes relate to curves, how essentially everything in the physical universe transforms over time. Before calculus, mathematicians could describe static things beautifully. After calculus, they could describe everything. It is not an overstatement to say that modern physics, engineering, economics, and medicine would be impossible without it. Every bridge you have crossed, every aircraft you have ever been on, every medication that has been optimized for dosage and effect calculus is buried somewhere in the foundation. Newton built that foundation in a farmhouse during a plague while he was 22 years old and then put it in a drawer. He went back to Cambridge in 1667. He became a fellow. He became a professor. He began corresponding with other mathematicians and scientists, cautiously, selectively, and with an almost pathological reluctance to share his methods. He would sometimes write to someone about a result without explaining how he had obtained it, as if he wanted the credit for the destination without anyone tracing his route. Other times, he would encrypt his discoveries in anagrams so that if someone else independently found the same thing later, he could reveal the anagram and prove he had gotten there first. He was not a scientist sharing knowledge. He was a scientist, staking claims on a map he refused to publish. His relationship with Robert Hooke began here. And I mention Robert Hooke specifically because the subplot of Newton's life, the thread that runs underneath everything and resurfaces at the most revealing moments, is not really about calculus or gravity or light. It is about Newton's relationship with the concept of sharing credit with another human being. Hooke was a brilliant experimentalist, one of the best in England, and he and Newton corresponded about optics in the early 1670s. Hooke offered some criticisms of Newton's theory of light, polite, substantive, scientific criticisms. Newton's response was to immediately try to withdraw from all public scientific life, write to Henry Oldenburg at the Royal Society that he wished to be removed from the Fellows list, and spend the next decade nursing a contempt for Hooke that, by most accounts, never fully dissipated. The line he eventually wrote, "If I have seen further," it is, "by standing on the shoulders of giants," is quoted in every physics classroom in the world as a beautiful expression of intellectual humility. Most historians now believe it was a calculated insult. Hooke was short. Hooke had a curved spine from scoliosis. Newton's famous sentence about giants was written in a letter to Hooke, and Newton was not the kind of man who made accidental word choices. He was the kind of man who encrypted his discoveries in anagrams. He knew exactly what he was doing. Here is a fact that hits differently once you understand the context. After Robert Hooke died in 1703, Newton became president of the Royal Society. And after Newton became president of the Royal Society, every known portrait of Robert Hooke disappeared. We have no confirmed image of Hooke's face, not one. The man who independently discovered the inverse square law of gravity, who coined the word cell in biology, who built some of the finest telescopes and microscopes of his era, we do not know what he looked like, because the most powerful scientist in England apparently made sure of it. That is not grief. That is not indifference. That is a man with institutional power and a very long memory. But even that is not the main story. The main story is Leibniz. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was a German polymath born in Leipzig in 1646, 4 years after Newton. He was, in many respects, Newton's intellectual equal, and in social terms, Newton's complete opposite. Where Newton was reclusive, Leibniz was gregarious. Where Newton hoarded his ideas, Leibniz published constantly and corresponded with hundreds of thinkers across Europe. Where Newton had no close friends, Leibniz had a vast network of collaborators, patrons, and admirers. He helped found the Berlin Academy of Sciences. He worked simultaneously on mathematics, philosophy, linguistics, and theology. He invented a mechanical calculator. He proposed what would later become the foundations of binary arithmetic, the language every computer on the planet now speaks. He also independently invented calculus. Leibniz developed his version in the early 1670s, working in Paris without access to Newton's unpublished notebooks. He published it in 1684. His notation, the dy over dx, the integral sign that looks like an elongated S, is the notation we still use today everywhere because it is simply better than Newton's. Newton had gotten there first, roughly a decade earlier in that plague farmhouse. But Leibniz published first. And crucially, Leibniz shared his methods. He explained his thinking. He wanted other mathematicians to use calculus, to build on it, to extend it. He was not hoarding a map. He was drawing one and handing it out. For a while, the two men coexisted with a kind of cautious mutual acknowledgement. There was even a period of correspondence. Newton sent Leibniz letters in 1676, and Leibniz responded. The letters are fascinating because Newton typically was at the same time gesturing toward his unpublished work and concealing it. He included an anagram in one letter encoding a key result, as if to say, I have had this for years, but I will not tell you what it is. Leibniz, for his part, was open about his own methods and genuinely impressed. Then everything changed, and the mechanism by which it changed tells you more about Newton's character than anything else in his life. In the 1690s, as Leibniz's calculus spread across Europe and became the standard tool of mathematical physics on the continent, a dispute began to brew. Some of Newton's supporters, particularly the Swiss mathematician Nicolas Fatio de Dulier, began suggesting that Leibniz had not independently discovered calculus at all, but had plagiarized it from Newton during a visit to the Royal Society in the 1670s when he had seen some of Newton's unpublished materials. Leibniz denied this. Most historians today believe the denial was honest. The evidence for independent discovery is genuinely strong on both sides. But the accusation was out. And here's where you need to understand that Newton, quietly, in the background, was not trying to calm things down. He was accelerating them. Newton had suffered a nervous breakdown in 1693. The exact cause is still debated. Some historians point to mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments, others to the end of his close relationship with Fatio de Dulier, others simply to decades of solitary overwork finally catching up with a mind that had never really allowed itself to rest. He wrote letters to friends during this period that were confused, paranoid, and deeply unlike his usual controlled prose. He accused Samuel Pepys and John Locke, two men who admired him, of trying to entangle him with women and other schemes, in letters that made no apparent sense. He seemed briefly to have come apart. He put himself back together. He became warden and then master of the Royal Mint in 1696, a position most people assumed was a comfortable ceremonial reward for a great scientist. Newton did not treat it that way. He personally went undercover into the taverns and criminal dens of London to gather evidence against counterfeiters. He oversaw the prosecution of dozens of men and sent them to their deaths. The great theorist of gravity was also, in practice, a dedicated and apparently relentless agent of the state who found hanging people for coin clipping to be a perfectly reasonable use of his remaining energy. He was knighted in 1705. He became Sir Isaac Newton. And then in 1703, Hooke died, and Newton became president of the Royal Society. And from that platform, he turned the full force of his institutional power toward destroying Leibniz's reputation. The Royal Society launched a formal investigation in 1712 into the question of who had invented calculus. Newton, as president, appointed the committee. The committee was composed almost entirely of Newton's friends and allies. The committee produced a report, the Commercium Epistolicum, which found conclusively in Newton's favor. The report was anonymous. Newton later wrote the anonymous review of his own report, praising it in the third person. He also, apparently, made edits to the committee's document before it was published, strengthening the language against Leibniz. The entire apparatus of England's premier scientific institution was, in practice, one man adjudicating his own case and signing the verdict with someone else's name. I want you to pause on that for a moment. The calculus investigation was not just unfair, it was a theatrical production in which Newton played every role simultaneously: the accuser, the judge, the jury, the anonymous commentator, and the institutional authority that gave the whole thing legitimacy. He built the stage, wrote the script, cast the actors, and then reviewed the performance favorably under a pseudonym. Leibniz appealed. He wrote rebuttals. He asked for a fair hearing. He pointed out, correctly, that the committee was not impartial. The response from the English mathematical establishment was essentially to ignore him. Leibniz, who had spent his entire career building bridges between thinkers, found himself completely isolated. His employer, the Elector of Hanover, who had recently become King George I of England, had moved to London and had essentially abandoned his old court philosopher in Hanover. Leibniz wrote to anyone who would listen. Nobody in power listened. He died in November 1716 in Hanover, working at his desk, attended only by his secretary. No colleagues came. No representatives from the academies he had helped build. No delegation from the English court. His grave went unmarked for 50 years. Newton lived another 11 years after Leibniz died. He was 84 years old when he finally went. He was rich, celebrated, internationally famous, and by almost any external measure, triumphant. He had won. The calculus dispute was officially settled in his favor, at least in England. His portrait hung everywhere. Streets would eventually be named after him. He had become the secular patron saint of rational thought, and he died, as far as anyone can tell, essentially alone. He never married. There is no serious historical evidence of a romantic relationship of any kind. His housekeeper's niece, Catherine Barton, lived with him in his later years and managed his household. She was warm and sociable and popular in London society, everything Newton was not, and by most accounts, she genuinely cared for him. But even with her, Newton maintained a fundamental distance. He once wrote that he had never lost any time on women. He said it the way other men might say they had never lost time on gambling, as if the possibility of emotional intimacy was simply a budget item he had declined. Here is the thing about Newton that keeps me up at night, and I mean this genuinely. His isolation was not accidental. It was not the tragic byproduct of genius, the way we sometimes like to narrate these stories, where the brilliant man is simply too far above the crowd to connect. Newton's isolation was a choice that he remade every single day, and the evidence suggests he was aware of it. He wrote at various points in his notebooks about the importance of not being disturbed, about the necessity of working in silence, about the way conversation and social obligation fractured concentration. He understood perfectly well that he was choosing his work over everything else. What is striking is that this choice in the domain of pure science produced perhaps the most extraordinary results in human intellectual history. The Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, is not just a great book. It is one of the foundational documents of modernity. It gave us the laws of motion. It gave us universal gravitation. It described the mechanics of the solar system with a precision that would not be meaningfully improved until Einstein. It did for physics what Newton's own metaphor about giants was supposed to do for science generally. It gave everyone who came after a place to stand. But the same closed-off, defensive, never-surrender psychology that allowed Newton to produce the Principia also produced the calculus war. The same refusal to let anything go, the same inability to accept challenge without treating it as an existential attack, the same hoarding of credit that kept his notebooks locked for decades. These were not separate personality traits from his genius. They were the same trait, operating in different domains. This is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, because the tempting interpretation is that Newton's awfulness was the price of his greatness, that you cannot have one without the other, that the obsessive closed-off machinery that solved gravity was inevitably the same machinery that destroyed Leibniz. And maybe that is true in Newton's specific case, but it is worth noting what that framing costs you if you accept it too easily. If you decide that genius excuses cruelty, you have quietly decided that the people on the receiving end of that cruelty, Hooke, Flamsteed, Leibniz, deserved what happened to them as collateral damage in someone else's greatness. Leibniz did not choose to be on the wrong side of Isaac Newton's ego. He just invented calculus at the wrong time and published it honestly. There is a parallel story here that I find more interesting than the question of who deserves the credit for calculus. The parallel story is about what Leibniz's version of calculus actually gave the world versus what Newton's would have given it. Newton's calculus notation was dense, idiosyncratic, and extremely difficult to share or teach. It was built for Newton's mind and almost nobody else's. His notation for derivatives involved little dots above letters, a system elegant to him and baffling to almost everyone else. When Newton's closest allies tried to spread his methods on the continent, they failed. The continental mathematicians Bernoulli, Euler, eventually Lagrange built everything on Leibniz's notation instead. The entire mathematical revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, the work that gave us classical mechanics, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, and eventually the mathematics that landed spacecraft on other planets, was built on the Leibnizian framework. It was built on the notation of the man Newton tried to erase. So Newton won the political dispute and lost the mathematical one. His name is on the calculus, officially in the history books, at least in England. But the calculus that everyone uses, that you were tortured with in high school, that engineers and physicists depend on every day, that is Leibniz's. The world chose the dead man's version. I keep thinking about what Leibniz must have felt in those last years. He had spent his life building things meant to be shared. He believed, sincerely, that knowledge accumulated across borders and generations, that the point of discovery was not possession, but connection. He had genuinely thought, when he and Newton were corresponding in the 1670s, that they were colleagues. He could not have fully anticipated what he was dealing with. Newton was not a colleague in the ordinary sense of that word. Newton was a closed system. Energy went in. Almost nothing came out. And yet, Newton, in his final years, seems to have had at least one moment of something that might charitably be called perspective. He told an acquaintance near the end of his life that he seemed to himself to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before him. It is one of the most beautiful things he ever said. It is also, if you know Newton's life, completely bewildering. The man who rigged a royal investigation and wrote anonymous reviews praising his own conclusions was also capable, apparently, of genuine humility about the limits of his knowledge. He just reserved that humility exclusively for the universe and extended none of it to other people. Maybe that is the thing. Newton could be humble before nature because nature did not threaten him. Gravity did not have opinions about credit. A prism did not challenge his priority. The moon did not write letters to the Royal Society suggesting that Newton had borrowed his ideas. The natural world was a system he could study at a safe distance, observe without being observed, and understand without being understood. Other human beings were not like that. Other human beings looked back. The subplot of this story, the one I promised you at the beginning, is really a question about what we lose when we celebrate the output of a mind and quietly set aside the wreckage it left behind. Hooke's face is gone. Leibniz's grave was unmarked for 50 years. John Flamsteed, the astronomer royal, spent years collecting precise astronomical observations that Newton needed for the Principia. And Newton responded by pressuring him, bullying him, and eventually arranging for a preliminary and unauthorized version of Flamsteed's life's work to be published without his consent. Flamsteed spent his final years buying back and destroying as many copies of that unauthorized edition as he could find. He died having recovered about 300 copies. The rest are still out there, scattered across European libraries, permanent monuments, to what happens when a very powerful man decides your work belongs to him. What all three of these men, Hooke, Flamsteed, Leibniz, had in common was that they were brilliant, they were honest, and they had the misfortune of existing in proximity to Isaac Newton. That is it. That is the full explanation. You did not need to wrong Newton. You did not need to steal from him, or slander him, or undermine him. You just needed to occupy the same field and refuse to disappear. Newton died in March 1727. He was 84 years old. He had been in good health for most of his life, which, given his extensive work with mercury and other toxic substances, is its own minor miracle. In his final days, he refused the last rites of the Church of England, which, given that he had spent decades secretly writing heretical theology arguing that the concept of the Trinity was a historical fraud inserted into Christianity by 4th century political operators, probably made a certain kind of sense. Even dying, Newton had opinions he was unwilling to concede. He left an estate worth roughly £32,000, an enormous sum. He had no heirs. His papers went to relatives who had almost nothing to do with his scientific life. Many of his private manuscripts, the millions of words he had written on alchemy, theology, and prophetic interpretation of the Bible, did not become public until they were sold at auction in 1936. When the economist John Maynard Keynes read through Newton's unpublished papers after buying a large portion at that auction, he wrote that Newton was not the first of the age of reason, but the last of the magicians. Newton's private intellectual universe was vastly stranger and more medieval than the clean, rational edifice he had presented to the world. He believed he was decoding divine messages hidden in the architecture of the Temple of Solomon. He spent more time on alchemy than on physics. He believed the apocalypse was coming, and he had done the calculations. The man who gave us the laws of motion spent more total hours of his life trying to turn lead into gold and decode the book of Revelation than he spent on anything in the Principia. The universe he showed the world was orderly, mathematical, and governed by discoverable laws. The universe he actually inhabited was stranger, darker, and much lonelier. We remember the orderly one. We put it on t-shirts. We named schools after it. Come back to the very beginning of this story. A boy born premature on Christmas Day, small enough to fit in a pot, father already gone, mother about to leave. A 9-year-old writing in a ledger about wanting to burn things down. A young man in a plague farmhouse, rearranging the foundations of mathematics with no one watching. A powerful man writing anonymous reviews of his own work and signing them with borrowed names. What is the connection? I think the connection is this. Newton never really stopped being the boy at his grandmother's house, watching the light in the window of the home where his mother had chosen to live without him. He learned very early that the safest position was total self-sufficiency, that needing anything from another person was a structural vulnerability, that the only knowledge worth trusting was knowledge you had generated yourself, alone, in a room with the door closed. And that philosophy, applied to science, produced the Principia Mathematica. Applied to human relationships, it produced a 70-year campaign of institutional vengeance against anyone who dared to stand in the same field. Leibniz died with one person in the room. Newton died richer and more celebrated than almost anyone in England, and his official biography contains no close friends, no romantic partners, and no recorded moments of genuine vulnerability with another living person. The calculus is real. The gravity is real. The light through the prism is real, and it is beautiful, and it changed everything. The question the story leaves you with is whether the man who discovered all of it ever once looked at any of it and felt anything other than alone.